So with that, I think we'll get started. My name is Patrick. I'm an anarchist based in Vermont, the heart of Bernie country. And I am joined by Peter from the UK to talk about the Jeremy Corbyn experience. So what we're going to do for this one is at the start, talk about our respective social democratic candidates on each side of the pond, and then we'll open up for discussion between the two of us and among you all. Born in New York, Bernie was an activist from a young age, moved to Vermont, and after several rather quixotic campaigns in the 1970s on the Liberty Union Party ticket, these were third-party candidacies, he ran as an independent for mayor of Burlington, Vermont. This was a campaign that he won by just a handful of votes in the 1981 mayoral race. His tenure as mayor for most of the 80s was really, especially at the beginning, heralded as a bright light in what was a rather dark moment for official politics on the left. The Reagan administration was kicking in, so was Thatcher across the pond, and otherwise promising socialist and social democratic experiments like that of newly elected French President Francois Mitterrand at the time were starting to falter. Bernie got elected first and foremost due to his opposition to the proposed privatization of the Burlington waterfront. The waterfront looms large in this city. It is a waterfront city. It's right on Lake Champlain. It is some of the most beautiful views I have ever seen in the United States. And as you can imagine, as a result, that's some of the most expensive real estate. And with any town this size, it's about 40,000 people, the major capitalist class, the major forces of reaction and accumulation are based on land ownership. So it's the local landlords, both commercial and residential. So as you can imagine, a city in a chokehold of really vulgar landlordism and a local propertied class that was very much used to owning City Hall outright without any real pretense. The Bernie Sanders campaign was at first an oddity, and then it became a threat when it became more likely that he was going to win. The previous mayor that Bernie unseated had proposed a plan essentially to privatize that waterfront. At the time, Burlington was deindustrializing, and the waterfront was, for the most part, abandoned or close to being shut down. Industrial railway tracks, large warehouses that were based on an economic condition that simply didn't exist in Burlington anymore. This was a little slice of a rust belt way up in New England. And so for the residents of the town, this privatization, basically this handing over of public land to what were going to be condo developers, luxury hoteliers, marinas, the wealthy and their yachts, was an outrage, and Bernie tapped into it. At the point where Bernie decided to run for mayor, this was essentially a historical high watermark for activism and organizing in Burlington. Much of the reason why his candidacy succeeded, even by a razor-thin majority, was because there was already so much groundwork being laid before he ran. Now, an interesting thing happened the day after he gets elected. So Bernie wins by a handful of votes. The next day, and this is a legendary encounter, which both Bernie and the other person have recounted on many occasions. A very, very wealthy Vermonter by the name of Tony Pomerleau, who's the local owner of both residential and commercial real estate, knocked on Bernie's door. And Bernie answered, and Tony looked at him and said, "You may have won the race, but I own this town." And this was a statement that would be backed up. So despite Bernie's pledge to save the waterfront, his big slogan was, Burlington is not for sale, the waterfront's not for sale. Only a few years later, as Bernie finishes his proposal for the waterfront, when he releases it, when he unveils it, he's standing next to Tony Pomerleau. This is one of many instances where it's more than simply campaign pledges are violated, but it's a perfect window into how the promises and aspirations of people who seek elected office can come in conflict with the prerogatives of those who actually hold power in our system. Thankfully, there was a ballot measure that had to be passed in order for Bernie's privatization of the waterfront to get passed. And it failed. The bond measure failed after a lot of organizing. Bernie did move the city in a much more liberal direction than his predecessor, but he also oversaw increases in police budgets almost every year. He famously called the cops on protesters who had been picketing against the local Gatling gun factory that was supplying right-wing death squads in Latin America. He also co-opted one of the more radical proposals that many anarchists, including Murray Bookchin at the time, who had also moved to Burlington, had promoted, which is local assemblies as a form of municipal governance. This becomes one of the central points of what Bookchin would later call libertarian municipalism, and is a key political voice of his larger framework of social ecology. Bernie's plan, as passed through City Hall, were called the NPAs, the neighborhood planning assemblies. These turned out to be, despite a lot of fanfare at the start, really ways for Bernie to work around a city council that didn't like him. The NPAs that supported Bernie's measures were rewarded, got more funding, got more attention. Those who opposed them, from either the right or the left, were sort of left to rot on the vine. But most concertedly, there were a number of really potentially major changes that could have been done via ballot measure in the 1980s while Bernie was mayor, particularly around just cause eviction and outright rent control. Both of these failed despite Bernie being in office. The siphoning of social movement energies and personnel into the electoral machine and then the city machine itself, the bureaucracies that have to be staffed out with your allies. It meant that the one counterweight to both the local and state government and the local capitalist class, it no longer had the independence and the clear battle lines needed to fight back. So when Bernie moved to the right on a lot of these key issues, he didn't have the kind of organization arrayed against him to push back on it that his predecessor, or frankly his successors, had. I'm spending a lot of time in the 80s. Let me try and fast forward a little bit so we can get to the discussion sooner. As Bernie left the mayoralty to first run for governor unsuccessfully, but then run successfully for the US House and eventually the US Senate, it became clearer and clearer that Bernie wasn't interested in actually doing the traditional work that a social democrat in office would do in the traditional mold. He was not interested in building an organization. He has, since he's been elected, he has run it as an independent. His supporters, first getting elected to City Hall after he was elected to mayor under the banner of the Progressive Coalition, which eventually became the Progressive Party. Bernie was never a member of that. And to go even further, he made a deal with Democrats, the local Democratic machine, when he ran for US House and Senate. Not only did that require him to run as an independent, not as a progressive, and to endorse other Democrats, but it helped keep him away from something that he didn't want to do anyways, which is build organizations independent of his own campaigns. Now, when it came time to run for president, certainly there's been no lack of progressive candidates for US president on the Democratic Party ticket. Bernie's predecessor campaigns, is the ones he really inherited, were, like the Dennis Kucinich campaigns in 2004 and 2008. Bernie had actually considered primarying Barack Obama in 2012. These were political considerations that I think seem to be mostly based on particular conditions in Washington, D.C., more than what's actually going on in the country. There's a structural reason why the Kucinich campaigns didn't take off, in addition to, I think, some of the personality factors that are always a factor in electoral campaigns. Bernie was able to, at the time, tap a mood that was left behind by earlier movements against corporate domination, like Occupy Wall Street, the revolts and Black Lives Matter protests, similar offshoots. This was the perfect moment, and honestly, it took both Bernie and his campaign by surprise. This was not something that they had anticipated or expected, but this surge of enthusiasm, which was a combination of people being absolutely fed up with the political status quo, but also, crucially, a very strong anti-Hillary Clinton sentiment in 2016. A lot of commentators, including people like Richard Seymour over in the UK, has noted this about Corbyn too, that really the reason for how well they did as a surprise was not the result of the sort of the slow accumulation and accretion of victories for the far left, but really the profound weakness of the neoliberal center. There was simply just a lot of disarray and not very much energy for the project, which in previous decades had propelled people like Clinton and Obama. This was a new reality, and the mainstream political operators in both the Democratic and Republican parties had not yet accommodated it. In 2020, Democrats actually took a page from how Trump won the nomination in 2016. They learned the lesson that the other party figured out. In 2016, as folks may remember, Trump's victories began with pluralities. So these early states that Trump won, he didn't win a majority, but he won a plurality, which still made him a victor. And that momentum that he built eventually got him to start winning majorities. And because his opponents were, they were all fairly plausible candidates who couldn't agree on who would bow out first, Trump was able to cruise to the nomination. As many of us may recall, in early 2020, President Obama's phone call to the array of contenders for the anti-Bernie vote meant that there was a wave of sudden withdrawals and endorsements of Biden. This was absolutely key to how 2020 worked out. In terms of the movements around him that were affected by him, DSA, I think, is certainly the elephant in the room. And for those at the book fair right now, I believe that, yeah, there may be a DSA table in the room physically. DSA grew a ton during the Bernie campaigns, but especially after Trump won, there was a huge spike, even more so than during the 2016 campaign, in terms of the rate of growth. And that's a significant factor. While DSA as an organization, prior to say 2015, when things started to pick up again, really their history is sort of in the fetid backwaters of US social democracy. This huge jump in membership from around 1,000 or so members to almost 100,000 members has really made this essentially a new organization. And DSA itself is, I think, much more multi-tendency than a lot of people give them the credit for or understand. And I think really what happened is there was a serious lack of easily accessible multi-issue leftist activism. And DSA was in the perfect place at the perfect time to take advantage of that and use it to grow. And so we see some of the most beyond electoralism, which I think is largely a dead end. We can talk more about why. DSA members have been, I think, productively rebuilding a lot of tenant organizing and local labor organizing. So I think it's a multi-tendency organization in the best kind of sense. But it's a story that I think absolutely intersects with the Bernie campaigns. And then I'll wrap this up in that there were, I think, a few things that both Bernie and Corbyn showed to the left, generally speaking, in terms of the lessons learned. As we see in almost every instance, when leftists do get elected into power, they almost immediately move to the right, like right after the election. We could see that in those moments when Bernie and Corbyn looked most likely to succeed. There were overtures to Wall Street, overtures to the capitalist class. This was a preparation, and it's not a matter of personnel. It's not a matter about getting better politicians elected to do the things they actually pledge. This is a matter of structures and systems, and so we have to think about it that way too, getting beyond the personal and actually think of these larger political fights. We've also noticed that really elected socialists, when they are elected, they haven't really been a toehold of the socialist movement within the capitalist state. They've really been the reverse. They've been a toehold of the capitalist state within the socialist movement. We've seen the kind of tendencies toward cult of personality that candidates on both the right and left can have this sort of distorting effect on political sensibilities of people, especially when we're trying to organize. I think we've also found that political power is generally built elsewhere. And even traditional social democrats sort of understand that. there's a general consensus that the way you build up to, a social democrat running the government or a social democratic party running it, is these parties emerge out of a strong militant and organized working class movement, or movements plural. That you really can't do one before the other, because this was essentially a historical fluke for both Bernie and Corbyn. There was first this acknowledgement that, oh yeah, no, we shouldn't be able to do this. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but this is usually, we're putting the cart before the horse. As these campaigns went on, the calculus changed, and we see quite a bit of opportunism in the commentariat, especially in the pages of organs like Tribune and Jacobin, saying that not only can the cart be put before the horse, but really that's kind of the only way this will work now. We have to put people into office and then build a movement to sort of like backfill that up. This seems like a rationalization of the absolute worst sort. And thankfully, now that these campaigns are in the rearview mirror, they haven't really brought this up that much. But that's something we need to really watch out for, because that kind of sentiment will be not only intrinsically incredibly elitist, and I think anti-socialist in broad brushstrokes, but if that's adopted, if that is widely accepted, that will simply lead us down the primrose path to making the same mistakes again. Of course, there's a lot more we can talk about. We both love to engage with questions and stuff, but I want to hand it over to Peter now to introduce yourself, Peter, and talk a bit about Corbyn.
Thank you for that. So I'm Peter. I'm with the Anarchist Federation here in Britain. I probably now know more about Bernie than I know about Corbyn's history, but let me fill you in a bit. Corbyn started his political career in the 70s after a stint in South America, where he spent time as a journalist and a geography teacher, and attended the May Day rally for Salvador Allende. And that's where he kind of like saw Marxism like truly become something that can unite the different traditions of the country. And when he come back to Britain, that was something that was key to his politics. He immediately joined the trade unions. I think it was the garment and the tailors and garment union, workers union it was. And from then on, he's been deeply involved in trade unions in Britain and has a lot of support there. He was was a councillor in Connery, sorry, and his part in Labour was very much on the left-wing socialist part of it, which at the time was fundamental to what Labour was, as the opposition to the Conservatives, who at the time were utterly devastating Britain in the name of capital gains and the wealth, and in the name of the wealthy. And his politics were pretty much right on, as he became MP of Islington North in 1982, and he was very vocal in support of the miners' strike in 1984, a big supporter of gay liberation. He was involved in the anti-apartheid movement and anti-war movement. He was even part of the organising body of anti-fascist action, anti-fascist action, and by every metric you have here, as an anarchist, I have no time for Marxists, social democrats anyway, but pretty much as good as you could want a candidate to be. This changed when he gained leadership. So what happened there is Labour got power in 1997 with Blair, and Blair's whole move was to take Labour away from its trade union base and its working class roots at the time and make it more appealing to the middle classes. They wanted to improve business and infrastructure and expand the police and all this kind of stuff. And then ultimately they took us to war in 2 illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and their popularity began to wane. And subsequently, Blair was outed and he left and was replaced by Brown, and followed by Ed Miliband, and the Labour Party's popularity dropped. And after the 2015 elections, where Labour got massacred, Ed Miliband stood down and they had a leadership election. Now, I was an internal election for Labourship members only. The membership exploded by 100,000 people. It was full of entryism from the Conservatives, from the Communist Party. It was a great hoo-ha. 56,000 people had their votes removed from them. And in the end, Corbyn won and became leader. And this is what started then is a period of what we call Corbyn mania, where people who had never heard of Corbyn, who didn't care about the ins and outs of the political world, were suddenly in love with him. He became this massive celebrity in Britain. Every time he went to hustings, there was thousands of people cheering him on, protesting his name, singing songs of him. He became like this pinnacle leader for the socialist movement. And what that started was a massive divide in anarchism in the UK. And this went on into the 2016 local elections, where, well, I think Labour lost 18 local seats. And so basically Labour had a crisis of faith, really. Are they a party of the middle classes, or are they a party of this socialist demagogue and this populist candidate? And it was a time of great turmoil in British politics. And what resulted after that is we had the 2016 EU referendum. And notably, Corbyn went on holiday because his politics originally were that he wanted to leave the EU. And when the EU referendum came around, it was based on the right wing's desire to have sovereignty and to take Britain for the British and get rid of those Europeans. We need to have power over our own lands. And it was incredibly divisive in Britain. I think the election came down to like a couple of percent. And Corbyn was basically very lukewarm through all this. And after this, I think 3 days after the EU referendum, there was a series of shadow cabinet resignations, and the party went into a bit of crisis. And then we had the 2017 general elections, which, much like the 2019 general elections, saw Labour lose, but on the basis that Labour refused to work with the other parties or have a rainbow coalition or whatever. And so for me, like, where Corbyn comes into this, sorry, I'm not going into as many details as you did there about Bernie. For me, like, the thing about Corbyn coming into power is that, like you say, immediately when he was the leader of the opposition, his politics, his radical anti-war sentiment, his fighting for socialism became very muted as he had to capitulate to pleasing the rest of the party, which was right wing. And like, we don't like to talk about this in Britain, and it became a very divisive thing that we had anarchists swearing blind that Labour were now socialists, and everyone in the Labour Party was going to lead us to a bright new revolution. If only we can get them in. We got to get the Tories out. But that wasn't repeated by the Labour Party. In those elections, we had the Greens, who are basically Tories on bicycles, and we had Lib Dems, and we had Plaid Cymru and the Scottish National Party, all offer to work with Labour in a rainbow coalition, only to find Labour saying, no, we're going to do this alone. We don't care about the other parties. We don't care about the people. It's all about Labour. And this is the thing about Corbyn from start to finish, that despite talking about socialism and the working class and helping people unite and all this kind of stuff, it's really about gaining power for the Labour Party. The party's mother, the party's father, and everything has to come down to it. The trade unions went behind him. You know, we had the radical Marxists, the Communist Party, all put in their lot. And, you know, this spawned a great separation in British politics, where, for me, the issue comes around to the divide in the anarchist movement, where we started to undermine ourselves as a collective people who want autonomy and community, and started believing this false pariah that if we somehow vote in a leader, Corbyn or whoever, that's going to make a radical change in Britain, which, of course, as the opposition leader, it didn't. it wasn't just from the left mind, like the right wing the right wing in Britain had conniption about this. Like for them, suddenly they were fighting a Stalinist, right? They were terrified that Britain was going to become the USSR of Britain or something, right? We had things where he'd go to a remembrance gathering and he only bowed 10 degrees, and this was a travesty. It was in all the newspapers. How dare he not care about our servicemen? And it really, what it did with British politics is build it into like two hideously strong camps. Very similar to what America is. You got Democrats and Republicans, and they hate each other. They're loathing each other, and everything they do, you're either left or right. And this kind of campist mentality, like, really became embedded in British politics, and they're still here now because of Brexit, because of the 2017, 2019 elections, and Corbyn is responsible for a lot of that. And yeah, so what happened is this wave of populism and this wave of this need to like disengage from our own agency and place it in a Labour Party really undermined movements. And I think that's the core of like parties like people like Bernie, people like Corbyn. You know, they talk a lot about working with people and socialism. And in actuality, what they want is party power and to bring dominance. And it displaces this idea that that, you know, if we only get the right candidate, suddenly everything's going to be better. You know, where this idea that if we vote in a softer whip and a longer chain, suddenly we're going to have more liberty. And that's never going to happen. Even if Corbyn had won in the election and became prime minister, you know, the reality is he was talking about having 10,000 more cops. He wanted to, you know, he first came, his whole thing about becoming leader was that he wanted to force Britain to become high skilled and high tech. You know, he's not talking about ending growth capitalism, but embracing it and making it work for the middle classes. Because at the end of the day, these candidates, they're not interested in the working class. They're interested in increasing the power of the middle classes and the petty bourgeois and stuff like that. So, you know, I guess that at the core of it, what we have is this crisis of faith in anarchism, where for lack of our own agency, for lack of our own capacity and power and ability to create the society that we want, we hand it over to just another parliamentarian who is never going to be able to represent people, who is never going to be able to speak honestly in the interests of the majority. And even at that, the whole idea of voting and having a majority voice is itself deeply problematic, because democracy in itself, parliamentary democracy, is never going to represent people in their best interest. It's always going to speak for the big block of self-interested people who, in the US and the UK alike, you know, it's white, cis, male, and all the rest of it. And that self-serving interest only serves to undermine organising in the UK, as I'm fairly certain Biden's election is doing to America. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm kind of interested in when you talk about Bernie being in power and like in Vermont and stuff like that, and like what actual changes were found that were beneficial to people, and whether like anarchist organizing actually did occur like on a greater level because they had like a softer leader or whatever, or a more left wing leader. Because we never really got that with Corbyn. The Corbyn was never in power, so we never saw that. Whereas at least in Vermont, Bernie has a degree of power, right?
Bernie, as a senator, doesn't really have any political power in Vermont proper, but he certainly has persuasive power. His endorsements have historically been fairly important in other people getting elected into Vermont office, be it at the local or the statewide level. So certainly since he's gained power, he has become a highly sought endorser. However, the extent to which Bernie has in power had lasting effects on the state and on Burlington It's a pretty disappointing record. Every day, just about, residents of Burlington and Winooski have to deal with levels of noise pollution that are at best seriously distracting. Like it will interrupt any conversation you're having, and at worst, actively detrimental to your health. Thanks to a fleet of F-35 fighters that have been stationed at Burlington Airport, specifically at the Air National Guard base there. This is, for Bernie, who staked out his claim as the closest thing to like an anti-imperialist we have in federal elected office, quite shocking to someone who hears about this for the first time. These are F-35s, the very planes whose first test as a model in real life combat was actually the F-35s owned by the state of Israel. It's not some sort of mechanism to defend Vermonters from the invading Canadians. This is an incredibly expensive and frankly dysfunctional vehicle for US and capitalist imperialism. And it's not only polluting the air, but it's deafening the ears of his own constituents. And this is something he has firmly supported, along with the other senator from Vermont who really helped make it happen, Senator Leahy, and our one congressperson in the House of Representatives, Peter Welch. They're all big fans of the F-35. The problems with Bernie's defensive empire don't end there. Bernie also had people who were protesting the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, had people who were protesting in his congressional office about it arrested. This is a person who does not like his leftist credentials challenged. In terms of locally as mayor, like I was saying earlier, a lot of the positive social movement energy, unfortunately, left the streets and entered City Hall. And because City Hall is hostile territory, a lot of that energy was sapped and removed. A lot of the most inspiring social movement work that was going on in the city really got subsumed into electoral politics. And that includes Murray Bookchin's formations, especially around the Greens. The Greens adopted this strategy locally of running people for local office, sort of in line with Bookchin's idea of libertarian municipalism, that we elect people to city councils, and then those city councilors will create public assemblies, which will eventually become the primary political decision-making vehicles of this municipality. And several steps later, we get rid of capitalism somehow. That also sapped out a lot of energy because of that electoral turn. So you had a lot of people who then, as Bernie ran for president both times, stopped the organizing they were doing to help campaign. So in 2016, when he was running, some really good friends of mine who were dedicated labor organizers stopped what they were doing, which is organizing nurses in Vermont, and basically dropped everything to go canvass for several weeks, first in New Hampshire, and then later on in New York State. This had an incredibly disruptive effect on the local organizing drive. And we see similar kinds of decisions being made by activists and organizers to stop what they're doing. There's a presidential election on. We have to do this. This runs really in the face of what the past century has taught us, that elections are at best a reflection, not a cause of social change. The way I like to put it is, using elections to change society is like trying to turn up the temperature with a thermometer. You're looking at the wrong device. You need to turn up the heat. You don't need to just change the way you measure it. And we've seen this elsewhere. It's not just Bernie being a bad politician. I mean, I think he's a politician. Shama Sawant in Seattle ran into a similar thing, and even though she has a much, I think, more robust and traditionally socialist understanding of organization. She comes out of socialist alternative, but her election campaign was on $15 an hour for a minimum wage. 15 now, she called it. Once she got in office, unfortunately, it became 15 later, because instead of keeping the struggle as close to the workers and as close to the streets as possible, she decided to negotiate with a hostile city council and hostile business interests to eventually pass something that she could campaign her reelection on, which was a very much watered down, exemption-ridden $15 an hour minimum wage, which had a ton of pushed off timelines for actual adoption. That had a pretty dramatic counterpoint in the form of SeaTac, which is this bedroom community right next to Seattle. And instead of electing politicians to get $15 an hour, they decided to go via a ballot measure and take it directly to the people with an initiative that was very clear, written in stone, couldn't be tweaked, and it passed. And SeaTac got to $15 an hour much, much faster. So it's really been it's been rough. There have absolutely been votes that Bernie has voted on and initiatives that he has passed that have made improvements to the material conditions of people in Burlington and Vermont. Absolutely. And in the US, let's be honest, there's no evidence that you actually need a socialist in office to do that stuff. The most you need is a liberal who can be in office to be the one to accede to popular pressure. Everything, for example, that Larry Krasner has been able to do as DA in Philly has been accomplished elsewhere, not by investing in political campaigns, but investing in popular movements. And I'm sure there's a lot of this in the UK too, this inside outside idea, like, well, we could have people, we can have organizations basically do both. We can invest in elections and we can also invest in organizing. But as we've seen, electoralism, the specific act of electioneering on behalf of a candidate, is a uniquely corrosive activity to the rest of social movement building.
Just to check, we got a question there. I'll read it out if that's okay. Someone asks, can either of you address the appeal of Sanders or Corbyn to anarchists? Was there an appeal? If so, why exactly? Anecdotally, it seems like some anarchists, or kind of anarchists, were attracted to Sanders or Corbyn. We all know that electoralism and electoral politics coexist with grassroots organising and movements. The issue is to what extent does the grassroots, through maintaining our organising and integrity and growing, push the opportunist electoralists into doing useful things or less harmful things? And to what extent do the electoralists cannibalise social movements? Are there examples of the latter happening in the case of Sanders and Corbyn? I would assume so, if you could give some tangible examples. So, when Blair was in power, right, they took us into two very illegal wars, and there was a massive uprising in Britain, right? 1 million people marched against the Iraq War, and this led on to dozens of new formations, right? From anarchist, socialists, like local level networks building up, because people were tired and they realized that Labour Party was never going to speak for them. They realized the whole hypocrisy of the voting system. And what we had is a resurgence in political radicalization. People got motivated. People started making anarchist groups. I got motivated. And when Corbyn came into power, what we had is a shift in the way people got radicalized, right? Corbyn was very successful in kind of like getting the younger voters to back him, right? He like for us, like as an age-old trade unionist, he goes to Toll Brothers Martyrs Festival, he went out of his way, or like his PR firm or whatever, whoever's were helping him, to get young people involved in Labour Party, right? And so that energy that existed before for recognizing the flaws in the democratic parliamentary systems, right, turned to, hey, let's support Labour. It became infatuated with this idea of like democratic socialism as a way forward. And the problem is you can't make the ballot box represent the weakest among us, right? You can't decolonize it, and you can't make it speak for the silent. Our communities are set between the ultra rich and the petty bourgeoisie. Socialist Democrats don't want liberation. They want a larger share of the resources for the middle classes who maintain their power. And when we had Corbyn rise up, this is what happened. People transferred their political energies from their community to this idea of taking over Westminster, right? And they were trying to fix these hierarchies or whatever, but it's all on the surface. You can't make a brutal system less unjust. All you're doing is actually harming movements that appeal to the community, whether that's anarchist or otherwise. Like, local organizing dies under social democracy, under the softer whip, because we transfer our agency to them and we hope, okay, they'll save us, they'll bring in the policies that'll help, underprivileged minors or whatever. But like the reality is, like, these parties, they don't serve you, they don't serve me, they serve business, right? In the local level to the regional level and the national level, they want business growth, right? They want to improve industry. They want to show how they can maintain power and keep it. And that goes against everything that anybody who's minded towards personal or communal liberty should stand for. What we need to do instead is evolve new forms of social organizing where we have like direct participation within our communities. And when you have a major campaign to support a candidate or a party, you lose that. It's gone. We're not weakening the power of the aristocracy. We're just making it easy for them to control us. And like, this is why we have like so much voter apathy, because like, I don't know what the election turnouts are like in America, but in Britain, in the last one, the largest voting bloc was did not vote, right? Because they recognize that this system is bullshit, but they feel there's no way to work against it. Because one of the problems that we have as anarchists is that we are not doing enough to build our communities up. We're not taking the time to step up and say, okay, let's organize our local communities. But there's bits and pieces, but it's not enough. And when these elections come about, what we saw was half the anarchist movement just kind of disengage from organizing, because any organizing was then seen to weaken labor, right? And when Corbyn kind of like fizzled out and everyone kind of recognized that, suggesting that we need 10,000 more police on the streets was kind of counter to anarchism. We saw the rise of like political parties that had an anarchist base, right? There's a Black Rose Labour and the Harmony Party. These little bodies come up, and they think that somehow embracing electoralism, somehow trying to get your candidate to be the one who's doing the speaking, is somehow going to give people personal liberty, and it doesn't. That I can't think of a single example where where local and communities autonomy has benefited from having your socialist populist demagogue in power. And like, there are other places in the world where the left wing or whatever have like achieved some political wins. So you got like Syriza in Greece, right? And when that coalition came in and was like, hey, okay, right, the left wing going, and what happened? When they got into power, the anarchists stood up and they had a new enemy, because they knew what they were. The anarchists knew what they were fighting for in Greece. They haven't been beaten down, downtrodden to the point where they feel the need to appeal to some distant bastard who's going to speak for them, because he never will. And ultimately, Syriza just turned out to be yet another political party, only keen for their own sense of power and for increasing the wealth of the middle classes. And yeah, I mean, do you want to answer that question from the US, I guess?
Sure. Yeah, I think those are really good points. As we've seen, social democrats in power they're usually the best, most effective way to actually roll back the welfare state, much more so than liberals or conservatives in office. And I think it's worth diving into the reasoning why that is. Why it was Tony Blair's government that was able to roll back so much of the safety net that even like somebody like John Major didn't do. Syriza gets into office and implements an even worse austerity program than the government that was to their right that they succeeded. And that's because the relationship between these leftist politicians and social movements, when they're so closely intertwined, it's not easier for social movements to place demands on government officials quite the opposite. It makes it easier for capital to impose its demands on movements because like I said earlier, the clear lines of battle and of opposition are muddied when that happens. These kinds of electoral political visions they come from a very distinct history. The height of these kinds of politics really were middle of the last century when they were most prominent. And there were distinct political, economic, and international conditions that allowed that to happen. You had, for one, you had the Soviet Union. You had a Soviet bloc that actually, for all its horrors, was absolutely a challenge to capital accumulation in the West and for the survival of political elites in the West. They were able to be called out, shall we say, in a way that simply doesn't exist anymore since they fell. This is often goes unspoken in, say, the histories of the civil rights movement, of civil liberation movements in the 60s and 70s, when these atrocious cases of police brutality, lynchings take place. It also took place in an international context in which the US was vying for a more secure global hegemony. And so the matter of international optics actually counted. So this played out elsewhere too. In Europe, the Soviet Union was right on their doorstep. It's not strange or contradictory that Scandinavia, which has historically had to deal with an expansionist Russia, first imperial and then Soviet on its doorstep, has such a strong social safety net, right? This kind of geopolitics actually does matter. You also had tons of capitalist profits at that time period. This was before things started to fall off the wheels in the 1970s. Not only did you have combative and militant working class movements to make these demands, you also had capitalists who were profitable enough to actually accede to those demands on occasion with caveats. You also have the source of these profits being based on millions of exploited people oceans away. The extracted fossil fuels that drive the taxable profits that make these welfare states hum. It's not often that people who are hoping to transplant these social democratic visions from the past into the present and future really grapple with, but I think they need to. And they need to understand why it was often the very parties that brought these social programs into office that were the ones who actually oversaw their dismantling and destruction. And unfortunately, issues of climate change actually haven't provoked the kind of reckoning with the nature of the state that I think a lot of anarchists had hoped. You have people like Andreas Malm, Christian Parenti, who are saying, look, we're running out of time. And they're absolutely correct. We are. Both of them have excellent critiques. But in terms of their constructive programs, they still adopt a view that the capitalist state can be seized and used for anti-capitalist ends. It doesn't work any better if you're in a rush. You can't speed run your way to state power. And I'm curious, Peter, since you're physically, much closer to COP26, which is just wrapping up now, how are you seeing that play out in terms of like the official left and the political classes as they wrangle over things in Scotland?
I mean, COP26 is an interesting one because essentially it's a massive performance, right? You have the you have all the industrialist lobby going there. You have the politicians from around the world flying in, and they're doing all their backroom deals, right? And you have the NGOs and civil society kind of like sucking up to them and going along and doing their speeches and stuff like this. And they're going along with this waltz, right? But outside of COP, the people not allowed in, right? Therefore, they're saying this is bullshit, right? This is not democracy. This is a sham. This is a show, right? You let people in for their speeches, ignore them, ignore people who are drowning in water and dying in fires because they're not economically viable to look after, right? You're greenwashing massive companies such as Shell, for example, who they've made this big thing about how they've come, how they've changed their mind. We're investing in green technologies. We spent 900 million investing in our new, brighter future. Yeah, they're not talking about the 18 billion that they're investing in ongoing oil and coal and gas and stuff like that, right? And like, so this is like, you know, the way our democracies work. That they're a sham. They offer you these. They placate you with these little piecemeal solutions, right? While in the back room, they're destroying the planet, right? And whether it's conservatives, whether it's Labour, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, it's all the same. Because the people that they're appealing to are the people who are destroying our societies. And they're hoping to maintain this majority, to keep them in power, to keep the popular vote behind them, because that allows them to increase their profits, and that allows them to kind of transition away from like, oh, we're a horrible dirty industry, to we're bright and clean and future, and we're going to save the planet with our solar cells and, you know, whatever else. And all it's maintaining is just like it's almost like neo-colonial, right? It's like when they're talking about saving other countries and whatever, they're talking about their investments, right? How they can control those other countries, and like, you know, like it's the start of this trade war with China, and like China is investing in other countries to gain power and stuff. And whatever the talking point of the day happens to be, that's what they'll go along with, right? And the key problem with this is that, like, this idea that the right candidate or the right party or whatever can have this majority is counterpoint to liberty. Because at the end of the day, anarchism and libertarian movements, they aren't about democracy. They're not about maintaining a majority rule, you know, whether it's through direct or like representative, like it's about consensus, right? It's about listening to the people, not only in your community, but in your region, in your country, and throughout the world, building like a talking point where we can actually say, hey, okay, so what works for you isn't necessarily going to line my pockets and make me a billionaire, but it helps us all, right? Rather than dictating to the rest of the world, certainly not the working class or the, you know, the third world, how it's going to be. We need to work together. And no political party, no matter how left wing, whether it's in power or not, is going to do that. So like at COP, you have this like this very weird state of affairs where everybody who actually cares about the planet is locked outside, as they are in every single performance by the state, right? And at the same time that they're smiling down the cameras and being heralded as, you know, the future of ecology, they're flying in private jets, right? The 400 private jets went to COP, right? That's like coming back and forth, it's ridiculous. They had Jeff Bezos take stand and talk about all Amazon's new ways in which they're going to bring products to the world. It's going to be green and bright, ignoring the 400 million tons of plastic waste they produce, ignoring the fact that like he flew like 2,000 miles to attend just to give his poxy speech. And this is what it is. It's like, you know, the people of Britain certainly have just had weeks and weeks of this bullshit telling them that it's their fault, and if they only listen to these messiahs, these heralds, everything's going to be fine. And it's not, because what we need is for us to act, the working class, the, you know, throughout the world, to say, you know what, enough of this, we need to change it. And so someone mentions here, well, there's a couple of questions, but the next one up was, do you have any strategies, techniques and talking points that you use to convince comrades, neighbours, friends, family of the position that electoralism is a dead end? I find this to be a difficult case to make, even when the most left-leaning of my social circles. And you know what? It's near impossible. Like people, we become so used to letting somebody else protect us that we forget our own agency. We forget that everything that we have that is good around us was built by the working class, right? The capitalists, the politicians, they weren't out laying the roads or building, you know, wind turbines, or like, you know, they're not making hospitals. It's the workers who are doing that. And we don't need these, you know, these bullshit leaders dictating that, because they're only ever going to do it in a way that serves them. And that's why, despite the fact that every fucking scientist in the world is saying it's too late. We need to get global climate down, the increase down to 1.5. The best they can do is 1.8 last I looked. And that's because it's not economically viable to save the planet, right? And, at the end of the day, what's Malawi doing for the economics, right? How's that helping us? So fuck Malawi, fuck Tuvalu, all we care about is how Britain and America and, equally China can benefit off this transition and this changing face. And what's popular right now is saying that, you have some kind of socialist vision for the future, some like utopian green future, but as long as we can still drill the planet and destroy it in the background, right? And so like what we need to do in our communities is like pull our finger out and start fucking organizing. It's a lot easier to convince people that community matters when you're out there doing stuff in the community, right? When instead of relying on some bullshit fucking services from the council, you're organizing your community to do that service, to look after itself, right? Because, it's not necessarily like, it's this kind of like false kind of pragmatism that we kind of vote for. Like people say, well, there's nothing I can do, right? Oh, well, democracy ended segregation, but it didn't. People ended segregation. They fought for it. Democracy ended colonialism. No, it didn't. People across the world fought against the British and got rid of us. And a bunch of politicians later on saying, oh, well, you see, we're so great. We decolonialized the world. You didn't. And what's going to happen in the future is that, environmentalism and ecology is going to be saved by the working class, by people actually going out there and like changing our manufacturing processes. And they don't need the capitalists to do that. They don't need to be instructed to do it bit by bit. We can do it now. We just need to be brave and take hold. And whatever your community is, whether it's in a city, whether it's rural, you can take it on yourself to start making those changes, right? We need a stronger platform to disengage away from capitalism and create our own alternatives. And that's something that in the past 70 years, we've been remiss to do. There's piecemeal bits and, there's a lot of energy out there, but it's often directed in kind of like a reactionary way, kind of counter, So like when you've got in America, this upsurge of fascism, right? You've got anti-fascist groups, right? And then, they're going out there and they're standing to the fascism, fucking good on you, right? But at the same time, what else are you doing? Right? How else are we creating our communities? And what's been really lovely to see over the past few years is that quite a few of these organizations that kind of like came about with this like, oh shit, fascism is rising, let's stand up to it, have gone on to become more community centric, right? They've started loads of different projects, whether they're socialists or anarchists or just like civil society. They've extended that and they're building these alternatives. And that's where we need to put our focus in. We need to say, hey, okay, like food production, it doesn't have to come from like, some distant farm. We can bring that home. We can build our community. We can build, there's what is it in Detroit? They have the agri-hub, right? Where they took some empty plots and they built a farm and they're feeding people. And that's what we need to do. We need to have a look around us and say, okay, well, what's my vocation? What's my profession? What am I good at? And how can I put that to use? Because everybody can, right? And the more we do this, the bigger it comes. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones who protect us. We're the ones who save us. Not some distant authority, greenwashing their future so that they can maintain power.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. David, in terms of like talking points and stuff, it's tough, especially because you have this entire media ecosphere that's saying elections are super important. Usually what I try to do is differentiate between electioneering and voting. So electioneering is running for office, it's campaigning for people for office. Voting is simply, the act of voting. It's that individual activity. I think a lot of people get hung up on the question of the vote. And honestly, a lot of anarchists get caught up on that too. It's a distraction. Anti-voting as a sentiment or an organizing principle is a dead end. There will be people who absolutely consider voting to be sacrosanct and really important, that you will turn off when you say that, when you say boycott the ballot, don't vote. And then there are the ton of people who you should be organizing, who don't vote, and frankly, don't care the people who don't vote have not, for the vast majority of them, raised that to a principle. It's just they don't think about it that much. They don't think it's that important. The sort of anti-voting crusade that some anarchists go on, I think, is a dead end. You should think about it as a boycott. Disorganized boycotts help nobody. Organized ones can. So if you were, say, the CNT in Spain in the 30s, and you had members in the millions, then the question of whether to vote actually becomes a strategic question. And their abstention or participation actually changed the course of Spanish political history. We are nowhere near that level right now. And that only gets you to the strategic conversation itself. It doesn't say that this in that moment is the way to go. In terms of electioneering, I think when talking to people, it's really good to ground it in examples. And thankfully, at least in the US, the history of social movement victories shows that it's politicians in power who actually just step in for the last part. And that's the signing of legislation. If you don't have strong movements, you won't get anywhere. For example, like with Democrats in power without social movements banging down their doors include people like Clinton and Obama. Clinton, of course, did a number of horrible things, killing welfare, driving tons of people back into poverty. He allowed for right-wing media consolidation. He passed Glass-Steagall, which really set up the particular crisis that the world saw in 2008. And Obama, you ended up with the passage of a healthcare bill that's almost identical to what the Right-Wing Heritage Foundation was suggesting in the mid-90s. However, when there are social movements that are powerful during Democratic and at times Republican presidencies, you see huge changes. FDR in the 30s, Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. These were administrations that were bedeviled and beset by forces to their left, unruly forces that weren't only organized into, say, alternative parties or different organized projects, but were also had very traditionally disorganized and unorganized expressions, revolts and uprisings in large cities, militant and oftentimes organic, self-organized farmers' movements in the 1930s. When movements are in motion, whoever happens to be in office is forced to act. That's the real linchpin of history. And so what I would recommend for people who want to start to have these conversations, take voting off the table. Just like it's a non-issue. You're not going to convince anybody one way or the other. It's a red herring. Focus on not what we do individually, like in the ballot box, but what we do socially. To Peter's point, what are we doing to organize in our community, in our workplace, in our apartment buildings? And how are we not only convincing them, on an abstract level, but convincing them on a practical level? Our best propaganda of the deed is when people see anarchists organizing as anarchists doing things that improve the lives for the communities they're in. That kind of organizing, be it direct action, mutual aid, building up serious economic counterpower to disrupt capital flows. That's all what really matters. That's the best kind of propaganda in the end.
I kind of think that one of our most popular stickers in the AF is a white one that says a ballot box, and traditionally we stick it on bins during elections. And because it's this idea of the difference between an election and voting as a mechanic, right? Like you say, like take voting off the table, because the reality is anarchist syndicalists, anarchist communists, we do vote. We vote within our organizations. We vote people who are going to be accountable, and whether you call them delegates or not, like we put people in trusted positions, right? Except for we vote for motions and we vote for actions, and we prefer this to be by consensus, not by majority. We work towards genuine consensus, and it's not some grand parliamentary authority, but in our communities, whether that's in an anarchist federation, whether that's in your tenement block, whether that's on your street, whether that's in your hobby or whatever. We make decisions collectively and through consensus. So when we say, oh, don't vote, we need to be a bit clearer with that, because otherwise we're pushing people away. And it's kind of hypocritical for us to say that, because at the end of the day, even the most individualist anarchists or whatever, we do vote. We make consensus. The most beautiful form of consensus I ever saw was during a riot in Manchester, where 300 people who it would never occur to anarchism about them, right? There's let's just say they were not politically minded individuals walking down the street, and they came to a crossroads, and one of them says, oh, where are we going? and someone says, oh, why don't we go down to Deansgate? That's where all the fucking toffs are. And everyone goes, oh, right, yeah. And then somebody says, no, let's go to the probation courts. I'm due in on Tuesday and I can't be asked. And 300 people laughed and made that decision. That was a vote. That was consensus, right? And it happened very quickly because people spoke to each other and the popular will was found, right? And taking that little idea into our communities down to, hey, we have a community project, what are we planting? Hey, well, should we plant some carrots? Should we plant some cabbage? It's a discussion that you have. And this idea of consensus, of discussion, is critical for anarchists to have. We need to move away from this idea of winning and losing, from gaining a majority. That's kind of debate bro bullshit that you see on YouTube these days, where people are trying to win, they're trying to be the best. And we need to get rid of that bastard in our head that tells us that. We need to be working together and discussing things. And when you approach your community, when you talk to other people, whether they're comrades or just like, random people you're talking to on the street, this is something that we need to put across, that it's not about follow me and I'll save you. Anarchism isn't some political party. It isn't, the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a discussion. It's working together. How can I help you and how can you help me and how can we do this in a truly camaraderie way rather than profiteering off each other? And that's at the core of what we need to do at the smallest level. And if we do it at the local level, it'll grow and it'll be at the regional, the national level. And that's where you get, true autonomy in regions. Anyway, Karen.
Great. Yeah, I think that's an excellent addition. Spencer, do you want to hop on and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Patrick and Peter, for this. This has been a great discussion. I know we're running out of time, so I'll be brief, but I wanted to pose a concrete example of something happening now in my town and ask advice from either of you or anybody for the best approach to it. I was really struck by the description of the history of Bernie in Burlington in the 1980s, and how he took these, municipalist assemblies and then, kind of co-opted them, which I see as more of a failure of Bernie and social democracy than I do of libertarian municipalism. I'm kind of a Bookchenite, but so in my town, which is Ithaca, New York, which is very similar to Burlington, 2 candidates were just elected to common council out of 10 people, on essentially the city assembly, city council. And they were elected on what's called the solidarity slate, which was supported by the local DSA, which I'm a part of, and the tenants union and other progressive groups. And they ran as movement candidates. And I guess in their party platform or whatever, they say that they'll help to create assemblies, like neighborhood assemblies, which is in there because my partner helped to write their platforms. But I wonder now, so we have 2, ostensible movement representatives in city council. What do you think concretely is the best course of action for relating to them and perhaps using them to help to build actual power in Ithaca? Do you think that it's better to just say, this is a dead end, we shouldn't engage with them at all? Or is it something like, okay, it says in your platform that you will help create neighborhood assemblies, so let's actually do this and like push on that? Or something else, just like, I'm curious concretely in a situation like this, how we think that anarchists, municipalists, what have you, should relate to this and how concretely to use it to, to build power.
That's a great question. Lots of good stuff. I'll be real quick and then I can pass it to you for a minute or two, Peter, if that works for you. Yeah, it's tough. That presents a bit of a dilemma. We actually have in Burlington right now, there are some people who are fairly movement adjacent, movement sympathetic in city council. But it was telling, a lot of them got elected on a promise to actually pass just cause evictions as a charter change. This was one of those things that they tried to get passed while Bernie was mayor, and it failed. Unfortunately, what the cost of that was the Burlington Tenants Union itself. So much energy was required to lead this through this internecine bureaucratic process to get this charter change language approved by various committees, read a first, a second, and a third time in front of city council. At each opportunity, having to drag yourself back to city council to try and fight back against these insidious amendments that the opponents would put in to try and poison and defang the thing. That was such a suck of both time, energy, resources, some money. And then once it passed city council, it had to go to the voters. It then became this grueling ballot measure campaign in March, which eventually succeeded after many, many hours of door knocking, money spent on signs, outreach, flyers, all that stuff. But of course, the way this works in Vermont is because it's a charter change, the state legislature has to approve it. And so we had this charter change approved in March. The Vermont state legislature closed its doors for the session in early summer, having not even brought it up for a vote. And now it's been a month since, actually over a month now, since our governor withdrew the eviction ban. So now we have what essentially is all that work for nothing because it didn't pass, all that energy, all that debate, all that time spent that members of the tenants union could have been spending organizing tenants against landlords. That got put into this process, which has resulted in concretely many more people being pushed onto the street than they would have had tenants union members done other things. And I was in the tenants union for a lot of these fights, so I know this firsthand. I know people were wrestling with this. People of genuine conscience who really are trying to do the right thing. This was a miscalculation. A similar miscalculation was found with the NPAs. Spencer, as I think I know which Spencer this is, I can email you a chapter from a book that talks more about how the NPAs worked. But long story short, one of the reasons why they never attained the potential that they had, because I think anarchists are absolutely in favor of assembly democracy, as assemblies making decisions, right? The issue was in the past, like when Bookchin will recommend assemblies, he'll root those in history. He'll talk about the French Revolution, town meetings in the American Revolution, the Soviets in 1917, et cetera, et cetera. These were all bodies that were thrown together by people in motion during periods of intense struggle. These were not bodies that were put up during relative social peace in anticipation of those social struggles. And as a result, what people found in Burlington was it was very easy for these groups to be co-opted. They attained a pretty bourgeois middle class outlook because those were the people who had the most amount of free time and mental energy to attend these evening sessions, once a month or however frequently. So the conditions in which it emerged kind of hobbled it from the outset. So it never really attained the potential. During upsurges, though, popular assemblies are absolutely the way to go. Using city councilors to codify them into law, so we have them, which will then at some future point spur a popular uprising. I think that puts the cart before the horse. Peter?
So here in the UK, I don't know whether you have in America, we have people's assemblies. It's a growing movement based in socialism and parties like Left Unity and stuff. And the idea is gathering people around and having, these open forums where people can talk about what they want to do. And one of the problems that arise is that anarchists disengage from them. They won't have, it's socialist nonsense, it's whatever. And what we need to do is really change that. We need to be involved in our communities, okay, from the ground level, right? And it's about prefiguring our society so that it evolves in a more anarchistic way. We need to step in and rather than say, hey, anarchism is going to emancipate you, we need to say, hey, how can I help you emancipate yourself? And we have to argue the benefit of our ideas at these assemblies. Get involved if you have the personal capacity to and the inclination, absolutely go on and talk about what it would be for a community to start. Just steer them in a direction that avoids leadership roles. Steer them help steer them in a way that they're not going to be lobbying your local MP to give you a social centre. Take the social centre, talk to people there. Squatting a derelict land and turning it into a community garden is direct action. That's anarchism. You shouldn't be appealing to some higher authority to come and clean up the streets. You go and do it. And by the merits of you doing that, people will say, hey, okay, well, that's something I can get involved in. That's something I can do. And then they come along and they go, oh, so you're the anarchist, right? What's anarchism about? And that's where you say, hey, it's about the community, right? And this is something that we really need to re-engage with as anarchist communities. Like, you know, not just saying, all right, we're this insular block and like, you know, we keep to ourselves and, you know, we do our little projects. We need to get out there and get involved. Right? If there's a need in your community for a social center, go out and do it. Be brave, take it. If there's a threat of evictions, get together with some people and avoid and fight against those evictions. Don't appeal. Like for me, it's useless petitioning some higher authority to say, hey, please don't evict us. Get your buddies together, get to the evictions, organize a fucking community group where you're like keeping tabs on what's happening and turn up when the bailiffs do and say, fuck off, you're not evicting them, and fight back. Because unless we're willing to stand that line and say, hey, you're not evicting us, you know, hey, we're going to make this a social center. Hey, we're going to build up this barrier here where you are not coming in and you are not taking over no more. And we need to be doing that. And we need to be working with people who have never considered anarchism, who think anarchy is just riots on the street and whatever. We need to be showing them that anarchy is beautiful. It's community. It's working together. It's redecorating our streets. It's picking up the litter. It's, you know, helping people out. And so, yeah, absolutely. Get involved. Go along to these things. Talk to people there about what they need. You might find out that your skill set is helpful. If you're a painter and decorator, go and help paint and decorate someone's house. If you're, you know, whatever your vocation is, it can be put to purpose, and it's only going to get put to purpose when you go along and you talk to people and you say, hey, let's organize this in a way that doesn't have leadership, that doesn't have this incessant need to appeal to some power to save us, because it never is going to do that. You know, for direct action to be possible, you know, it needs self-organization, and we need to do that outside of our little insular groups.
Amen. Perdo, please ask your question. I know we're at time, but it is my prerogative as owner of the Zoom call to extend this a few minutes. So please go ahead, Perdo.
All right, I'll keep it brief. I thought that the broad sweeps of this discussion over the Bernie and Corbyn moments it's good if we could also bring in some local experience that we've had, and I thought I'd bring that up. I am part of the the Anarchist Black Cross Lowell Lawrence, and we've organized with Antifa and Pipeline Resistance and other things. But when the Bernie thing came up, it was our members, some of us who decided to branch off and get involved, not for the hope that we'll elect Bernie, but that we could broaden the base of our group, which was very small, maybe 10, a small handful of people, and that we could gather people from the left and introduce anarchism to them. And so we organized around the Bernie campaign in Lowell and gathered together some 30 people in December, just before the primaries. And then in the end of January, the Bernie campaign brought in some of the Democratic Socialists from Cambridge. And their approach to it was undercutting our efforts to organize local people. And they would bring in all of the Bernie folks from around different places, but not from our local area. And that was one comment I wanted to make, was that it was undercut in some ways by the campaign. Secondly, what did emerge from the group that we formed was some resonance with the Bernie campaign issues platform, and thought that we might try to work at instituting some of those ideas at a local level in our town. And so I thought I'd bring those 2 points up, that we did create some movement towards mutual efforts. And since that time, I've seen some good results from that, but wish to share that as a local experience. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Actually, if you If you're able to, if you could private message me your email address, I'd love to chat with you offline more about your experience with that, because that's I think that's really interesting. Yeah, let me do 2 quick points and I'll pass it off to Peter and then we can close out. One thing that it's really easy for us as radicals to forget about in our day-to-day organizing lives is our own political trajectory and the importance of meeting people where they are, and not just sort of like in the throwaway sense that we all know that that turn of phrase, but to really understand and sort of bake that into our strategy and tactics. I got to anarchism through the Green Party, for instance, but other people jumped from Bernie, or they were radicalized by by Occupy Wall Street, turning them from a liberal or even a conservative libertarian into a leftist. There's a myriad of different paths people can take, and giving folks the opportunity to understand and learn more at all of those points, regardless of this immediately means, oh, one more member of your group is useful and good. And one of the things that I've been trying to work on is really trying to put some meat on the bones of the idea that as anarchists, we don't have to elect people or do GOTV or contribute to campaigns to actually have a meaningful impact on election season. This is the one time that people feel like it's okay to talk about politics with strangers or even friends, something that's usually taboo in this country. That's a time when anarchists should be putting out our point of view and building structures, even if not explicitly anti-electoral, but doing the things we'd be doing anyway. Meeting people physically where they are. So if they're going to a Bernie rally, right, participating there. This is why I know some anarchists they sort of look askance at other anarchists going into and joining and participating in DSA. But for a lot of locals, that's the right thing to do. That's where people are. And just because they're at one particular point, on the political compass, that doesn't mean that that's where they're going to stay forever. It's really useful to think about ways to engage and interact with the political process that don't necessarily build up the state and our own exploiters, but actually to what you did, Perdo, build up real community power and the kind of bonds that'll last long after an election. But what do you think, Peter?
I think so. I'm an anarchist communist, right? I'm a radical. I want to have a revolution, and I want to build a new society in the ruins of the old, and all that rhetoric. But at the core of organizing, at the core of like building better communities, we need to remember that the plurality and context are critical, right? Not every solution needs the radical anarchist response. Okay, and if you're interacting with like your big trade union or your local community group or like liberal organization or even governmental group, I'd say do that. If that's where you are able to make some impact, do it. However, one of the things that I'd try and encourage people to do is to do so as anarchists openly, talk about places. There's this tendency for people to kind of be a bit incognito and like stealth in the anarchy, right? It's like going back to like certain bits of platformism and specificism. It's like we kind of weave our tendrils into all the different aspects of society and turn them anarchist bit by bit. I'd say go in there and say, hi, I'm an anarchist. This is my side of it. How can I help you? How can we work together? And I think the more of us who are open about anarchism and open about it, not in a way that it's just, hey, I'm here to confront fascism or I hate the state. So talk about the positive things we do. And instead of trying to just rebuild the wheel of all of our society out the blue, we need to be working with what we've got and how we can kind of like change that on the core local level to being more about community, more about emancipating ourselves, more about standing up for the people who are vulnerable, people who are often silent, whether that's through ethnic, social, or like ability or whatever, lines, whatever it is, we need to be acting as that voice where we can. And that involves getting involved with people who aren't necessarily going to be waving a black flag, and yeah, like, get involved where you can, talk about anarchism, talk about how it can like liberate people and put that into action. And that sometimes means working with people whose politics you don't necessarily agree with, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of anarchists, in my experience, make it themselves as part of other organizations. You know, that however people come into politics, you know, most of the people I've met, they're like, oh, I was with the Socialist Worker Party, and I thought, oh, what about if we did it like this, and then, oh, I discovered anarchism. And, you know, loads of people create it themselves, and then are just pleasantly surprised to find out that there's been 100 odd years of people writing about it. And you've got to kind of open that gateway, and that gateway can only exist if you're out there and you're involved and you're doing anarchist shit.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us, and thank you to all the attendees for tuning in.